Hello everyone, this is Nitpicking Nerd, and this is my review of episode 4 of season 3 of the Orville, called Gently Falling Rain. And in my opinion, this was the best episode of the season so far. It feels as if they're setting up all kinds of future stories which might be really good if they do them well. And it also continues all kinds of storylines from the previous seasons. And what I like in how the Orville are doing things is that they have all these galactic events, but they're always tied to the personal stories of the characters on the ship, and so it makes it much more interesting and dramatic and complicated when it's both a personal story and a bigger galactic story at the same time, and both of them are connected. And visually this episode was pretty perfect. There were a lot of very glorious fun landscapes, namely of the Krill homeworld planet with their huge city in a style similar to Blade Runner, and also there was a chase scene similar to Star Wars, and visually it was very good for a TV show, so I have no complaints. And unlike previous episode, the visual stuff wasn't done just for the sake of it. It wasn't shown just to show off. It was always part of the story, and it served to enhance the story, and it was like the icing on the cake on top of the story, so it didn't come instead of the story. It didn't steal screen time from the story and characters, and so that's why it did work in this episode. And the bigger story of the relationship between the Krill and the Union is also done pretty well. And in the previous season I complained about how quickly they resolved the differences and how quickly they became allies and friends suddenly because of the Kalon threat. Suddenly they forgot all about their past differences and past conflicts. And I complained about it because it felt kind of rushed. It happened too quickly, and we didn't have enough time to enjoy the Krill as the villains before they suddenly became the friends and the allies of the Union. And so this episode kind of corrected that by once again pitting them against each other despite of the Kalon threat, and that makes things much more interesting, much more challenging, much more complicated with all these different factions. And so I like the fact that they did that, even though while watching the episode itself it was kind of annoying because of how stupid the situation became, because if you have such big threat against both of them, why are they fighting each other? So it was kind of frustrating while watching the episode, but also I realized that this is the best for the show as a whole, because it will be more fun that way, with more dynamics, more conflicts, and more factions fighting each other and all of that. And they brought back the Krill villain lady called Talea, and the last time we saw her in the previous season she was pretending to be a human serving on the Orville, all in order to betray Ed, to get back at him for what he did to her in season 1. So it was similar to the Seska storyline from Voyager, and in Voyager she was pretending to be a Bajoran and then turned out to be a Cardassian, and then she betrayed them, and also she stole the DNA of Chakotay and impregnated herself, and so she had a kid with him which he didn't know about. And Voyager kind of chickened out of that conflict by eventually revealing that it's not actually his son, and so he didn't have any responsibility for it, and so they kind of chickened out on that whole storyline. And they do something very similar in this episode, but better, when they reveal that Talea had a child with Ed from their relationship from when she was pretending to be a human. I guess maybe if she was genetically altered to pass for a human, maybe that's what allowed it to be possible, since she's a different species, but because she was transformed into a human, that somehow made it possible. And in her religion it's forbidden to abort your baby, and so that's why she kept it. But at the same time she's leading a new political party which is very xenophobic against the Union, and so that's why she's hiding her daughter away from the public eye. And that also reminds me of Zial from Deep Space Nine, who was half Bajoran, half Cardassian, and Dukat's daughter, and Dukat became the dictator of the Cardassians at some point. And so there are a lot of similar elements in this episode, and I think here they have the potential to do it much better than it was done previously, because all of these ideas existed before, but very often in those shows it's as if they didn't know what to do with that and just ended it abruptly and just killed everyone off and didn't really resolve any of those issues in a satisfactory way. It also reminds me of Star Trek Discovery, which also had a similar idea in one episode when Ash Tyler discovered that his Klingon girlfriend L'Oreal secretly had a child from him and kept the child hidden from the public eye as she became the Chancellor. And it also didn't really lead anywhere in that storyline. They had that setup, but then didn't know what to do with it and didn't do anything. So hopefully in the Orville we'll actually do something with it later on, hopefully. And the beginning of the episode, when the good Chancellor was prepared to make peace with the Union, that reminded me of Star Trek 6, when the Klingon Chancellor Gorkon wanted to make peace with the Federation, and they had that meal with the Enterprise crew and toasted with them and all of that. So we have something very similar to that in the beginning of the episode, with all the admirals toasting with the crew leaders and talked with him about making peace and all of that. So that was a nice scene. And also there was a funny scene when they showed the crew leader a children's musical, and so they were kind of looking at all of it bewildered, because it's so unlike their own culture, which is like a warrior culture and all of that, and suddenly they're watching little kids singing, so that made me laugh. And also the song was about the sun will come out tomorrow, and for them it was horrifying, because for them the sun is a symbol of suffering and death, because they cannot be out in the sun. So that was also brilliant at how the Krill misunderstood the meaning of the song, that for them it was something horrifying and scary, and not cheerful as it was for the humans. And so a lot of really funny scenes with the Krill leaders. And then the Krill invite them to their own planet, and then we see that their planet has a thick layer of clouds, and that's why they don't have any sunlight on the surface. And their planet looks like a Blade Runner style huge city with constant rain and all of that. And we see Talea making speeches to the crowd and inciting them because she's very xenophobic, she hates the Union, she hates humans, and all of that. And she ends up winning the elections, and then the Chancellor doesn't want to accept the election results, and a lot of this stuff was obviously inspired by real life events of recent history, and it felt a little bit too much on the nose. If they made some jokes of it, if they used it for humor, then we can say it's a parody of recent events, but they're not really doing that either. So what's the point of that? And they raise the issue of fake news, for example, but they don't really suggest any kind of solution. So what should you do with that situation? Each side is creating fake news about the other, and that's bad. But what is the message? Like, what's the point of all of this? So I thought all of that was too much on the nose and not really funny. It was just kind of taking you out of it because it makes you remember real events, which I guess is the point. But if you don't have any kind of message or point to make about any of this, so what's the point? I think it could have been much more interesting if they actually showed that the other leader, the good chancellor who wanted to make peace, that maybe he wasn't totally peaceful, maybe he really did gas his civilians, as was mentioned in one of those clips of the fake news, that some of the protesters against him were poisoned by a gas, and then they said it's fake news. But I think it could have been much more interesting and shady if they said that maybe he actually really did that, and that would put the Union in a dilemma if they really wanted to make peace with that guy, even though he's gassing his own people. But with the bigger threat of the Kalon, maybe that's kind of a necessary evil they have to accept for now, so that would have been much more interesting, and also it would have made Talea less of a one-dimensional villain, if actually some of her points were correct, that maybe she overthrew a leader who wasn't totally kind to his own people. Maybe it will make her less of a one-dimensional villain, so it will make all of it much more interesting, much more complicated, and also leave the possibility of a redemption for her later, because the way they showed it is if that Chancellor was totally peaceful, nice leader, and she just killed him and took over and became a totally evil dictator right away. So I thought that was a mistake, and also raising the issue of fake news without actually dealing with the issue was a little bit annoying, and also it made Ed seem like a hypocrite, because I seem to remember an episode when they were dealing with that planet with the upvote and downvote system, and they tried to rescue Lamar from that planet because he was put on trial, and so they themselves were creating fake news and fed it into the system to try to get the votes for his favor to release him, and so they themselves did exactly the same thing. So hearing Ed criticizing that after doing that himself makes him look like a hypocrite, in my opinion. So it would have been better not to deal with that issue at all, and instead make that Chancellor a little bit evil in some ways as well, so that would make Talea seem less evil in comparison. So it will make all of it much more complex and complicated and interesting, and also make Talea less of a one-dimensional villain, which is much better for a villain. The way they showed it, as if she's totally stupid, because, you know, she doesn't care about starting a war with the Union, despite of the Kalon threat against both of them, so it made her seem extremely stupid, and I don't like stupid villains and one-dimensional villains. I think a villain who is clever and who is complicated and complex and not black and white with some correct points that you're almost rooting for that villain, it makes it much more interesting and fun. So I thought that was not done that well in this episode, but they did leave a little bit of humanity in her, because, you know, in the end of the episode They did show that she was concerned about her daughter, and also she wanted to save Ed because she still has some feelings for him, so she wasn't 100% evil in this episode, but pretty much close to that. Too much, in my opinion. I think it would have been better if she was a conflicted character who doubts her own decisions that might be redeemed in the future, and not so black and white, evil and stupid as she was, because, trying to kill the Union president who is her captive, so that would definitely have started a war with the Union. So what's so clever about that? From her perspective, it doesn't really make sense, and so that annoyed me a little bit. And the whole idea of the hybrid of two warring species and who is caught in the middle, who might be the bridge between them in the future, that's a clever, interesting idea that was done often in Star Trek but forgotten about a lot of the time, so hopefully in the show they'll do it much better in future episodes, maybe better than Star Trek did, hopefully. So maybe this character of Ed's daughter might be more interesting in the future. The potential is definitely there. I also didn't like how quick their meeting was, like he just met his long lost daughter and just talks with her for 1 minute and goes away, and there wasn't enough emotion. As I said previously, Seth is not the best actor for this role, unfortunately. I think it could have been done better, it could have been much more emotional, so it felt a little bit cheap with the personal drama, but the idea itself is good, so hopefully they'll do it in an interesting way in future episodes. And so Talea is basically Gul Dukat, who's hiding her secret hybrid daughter from the rest of the public, and it also puts the moral dilemma for Ed and for the Union if they should reveal the existence of that daughter, even though that would put her at risk. And as I said, I didn't like how Talea was shown to be too evil for the whole episode, as if we wouldn't get it otherwise, so everything was kind of super exaggerated at how cruel she was. Even her symbol looks kind of like a swastika, so I don't think it's necessary to go that far to have a good villain. It doesn't have to be so evil. It would have been more interesting if they toned it down a little bit and not have things be so cartoony, because that makes it simplistic and less interesting to debate. There was also the scene when Ed asked her why did she keep the baby, and then she says that in her religion it's forbidden to have abortions, and then she shows him what happens to parents who do it, and apparently they put them in a holodeck kind of room in which they show them a simulation of how their child would have looked like, and so that basically a psychological torture room to punish the parents. They don't show what they do with them later. Do they kill them after that or what? They didn't really show that. I think this is an interesting timing that this episode came out right as this discussion about abortion became more relevant from recent events in reality, so that's interesting. Maybe the episode is even arguing against abortion because that hybrid daughter wouldn't exist if not for Talea's beliefs against abortion, and so the episode doesn't really take any sides. They're simply kind of raising the issues and don't really have any point about it either way. And maybe it's good because this way it only raises the debate without taking any sides, and maybe that is the best way to approach all kinds of controversial questions like that, which don't really have black and white answers in my opinion. It all depends on the exact circumstances, so it's not a black and white issue. So anyway, this episode I thought was very interesting, visually very good, and with a very interesting setup for future episodes, which hopefully they will deliver good stories with a satisfactory resolution in the end. So overall I thought this was the best episode of the whole season so far. Let me know what you think and we can discuss all of this in the comments below, and I will see you all next time. Bye bye.